top, there is less and less for the people at the bottom. And therefore, they have to be mobilized through different means, not through pecuniary means or real rewards, but through symbolic rewards. And symbolic rewards are, for instance, telling them, you are white, and that is really good, you're hardworking Dutch people, and look at these lazy Greeks. Well, we'll get two speakers who will explain to you how lazy they really are. You know, they are of a lower social status. And then, of course, we have our own internal communities like Moroccans, etc. I mention this because it's so important to see that the euro crisis and austerity are not just economic processes, they are also profoundly political processes in which new ways of mobilizing the people behind the system that we have to be found. And these new ways are of a less savory kind. They are of a type of xenophobia, mobilizing against other people, etc. And the reason why that is so dangerous is because at the same time we see a proliferation of war risk and resort to violence under the label of the never-ending war on terror. Of course, started in 2001. Obama just the other day announced another war that again will run for many years, so Hillary Clinton will probably be the next president because nobody stands a chance against her, and it will be advertised to her as the first woman president and this and that. But in fact, she's the war candidate, as she has made clear on several occasions, and the nice thing for her is that she doesn't have to declare war because it has already been declared by Obama. That too goes back to 91, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, some naive people like myself thought that probably NATO would fold as well. You know, what's the point of having a defense organization against the red bear if the bear was actually dying? Instead, NATO took some steps which made clear that they wanted the record US defense budgets to remain at the level that they were. What happened afterwards was, of course, 93, the famous article by Samuel Huntington about the clash of civilizations, which I think must be read today again as one of the most important statements of the new wars that we find ourselves in today. That is confrontation with the Slavic world around Russia and the Chinese in Asia, and on the other hand, the Islam, which Huntington explains in the book version of his article, is particularly prone to terrorism because there are so many young men in the Islamic world. And as all the young men here will know, when you're a young man, the one thing that you want to do is to throw a bomb. No, what more fun can you have? And that analysis of Huntington has, of course, become true. The third thing that happened besides the turn to predatory neoliberalism and oligarchic capitalism, I hope you accept all these terms, and the new militant posture of NATO, which included very soon NATO expansion in Eastern Europe against all promises that had been made to Gorbachev, and also the Yugoslav war, of course, in 1994 and 99. The third thing that happened in 91 was German reunification, and because Germany reunified, it had to apply austerity for the first time. So the austerity that we have today is basically paying back for the austerity that Germany had in the 1990s when it had to reunify, and it basically crushed the East German economy, especially its industry, replaced it as a zone, into a zone of cheap labor, and that of course coincided with the sort of predatory neoliberalism that I just described. Now, I don't want to speak too long, so the last thing that I want to tell you is this. Today we have, after the crisis of 2007-2008, the application of this program, of which you have already seen these two first steps, so the step of 79 and the step of the early 90s, which included war, austerity, and a general change in mood away from class compromise and democracy to a more militant posture in which groups are identified that somehow don't deserve to have the sort of life that we are used to. which, again, I'm searching for my words here because it's more difficult to explain than the quantitative economic trends. But it's important because if you leave it out, you don't understand the fury and the dangerous political tendencies that can arise from a situation of economic crisis. And these things can balloon very quickly into political movements that we will be surprised by. And yeah, although we always think that in Holland, for instance, our Geert Wilders is a too insignificant man to ever lead a mass movement, I'm afraid that we have to count with very rapid developments if the crisis deepens and the other parties, as they are doing today, forget about their own programs and no longer defend the sections of the population that still are counting, for instance, on protection by the Social Democrats, who are in fact playing the neoliberal game today. Now, after the crisis, very briefly in one sentence, after the crisis, there was a brief moment when everybody knew that the banks were at the origin of the crisis. It was their speculative movements in the subprime in the United States and in Eastern Europe and a part of the European banks which had led to the crisis. But the moment that the governments of Europe and of the United States, but the governments of Europe bailed out the banks, which basically meant that they took on the debts that the banks had incurred, the narrative also changed. No longer, I mean, in England I remember that there was one brick thrown through the window of a banker. And of course all the other bankers were very concerned that bricks would very soon land in their gardens as well. But that didn't happen because the narrative of the crisis was completely reformulated between 2008 and 2010. Because by 2010 everybody knew that the euro crisis was caused not by the bankers, but by our lazy fellows here, who did all kinds of things, like, for instance, enjoying the Greek sun, enjoying Greek food, etc., etc. They'll tell you about that themselves. That, again, reminds you of the very profound shift in public attitudes that makes it understandable that you just don't have a crisis of speculative capitalism, but you have a crisis of society in the sense that we no longer accept the different ways of life that you find even in Europe itself. And we are also more inclined, through mechanisms that I often don't fully understand, but we're also more inclined to no longer want to talk to many people, but simply to bomb them. And these things are connected to each other through very intricate mechanisms, which have to do with fear, with disappointment, and with unarticulated anger, irrational anger. I was just in Italy for something like this, and I was told that 25% of the Italian people today are in favor of a 5-year dictatorship, which will bring all the necessary changes that Italy needs, but also will lead to the complete abolition of trade unions, because the trade unions there are seen as the last bastion which protects a privileged segment of the working class, especially public workers. And the funny thing, and in Holland that's also very strong and very pronounced, the funny thing is that the rest of the workers don't say, the precariat as they call it, the people with temporary jobs who flip from one job to the other. They don't say, we also want that social protection. They express through that anger and, negative feeling, they express a sense that these other people, these people who are protected, actually must be, that protection must be removed. They also must suffer the nasty way of life that the rest of us are suffering. And yet at the same time, high up there, are this handful of oligarchs. In Holland, I must honestly say, it's not so strong as, for instance, in France, where you now have something like 10 people who each of them own a newspaper on their own. Just like Abramovich owns Chelsea, so French tycoons own newspapers as a hobby. They lose money on it, but they like the idea of coming into the editorial office in the morning, saying goodbye, and and so on and so forth. Now, I also say goodbye because I'm running over my time, but I hope you see the point. It's not just an economic crisis, it's the end of the era of class compromise. It's highly unstable, and the way the states have stepped in to so-called save the banks actually has created a new round of speculation that's even more unstable than the one that crashed in 2008. Thank you.